Do you like to obey? Really? And that's one of those things that, we all recognize it as a good thing to do, and we would all like to portray ourselves as people who like to obey, but it's probably not something that we hear and we're like, oh, that'll be fun. Hey, let's have a party tonight. Y'all come over to my house and we're just going to spend some time obeying. See, it just doesn't have that fun ring to it. When I was a pastor in Clare many years ago, one of my jobs was to oversee our children's church. This was just a small church in a small town, and so there weren't a lot of kids, and so we knew all the kids. And really, almost all of my time overseeing the children's church was working with our teachers to help them figure out ways to control the triplets. There were three, that's why they're triplets, there were 3 boy 2-year-olds who were in our church. And you can imagine that 3 2-year-olds who live in the same house together and do everything together were a handful, especially because their parents hadn't really enforced a lot of discipline in the home. And so we spent a lot of time talking, how do we handle the triplets? And I remember one time talking to one of our junior church leaders, and she was telling me the story of trying to get control of the class. And she had over and over again tried to say, okay, class, let's listen now. Let's all sit down. Let's all take our seats. And it just wasn't working. And so finally she decided she had to just go after the one triplet who was causing the most trouble. So she got right up to him and said, you need to sit down. And he defiantly looked up to her and said, you're not the boss of me. Jesus is. That's a tough one to beat, isn't it? Sometimes I think people have a misconception about Christianity that it's all about who's the boss of us. And we get this idea that Jesus or God is somehow a boss who sits in heaven demanding obedience and just waiting for us to disobey so he can get us. And I think one of the reasons people have this misconception about Christianity is because they don't understand one of the foundations of our faith, the 10 Commandments. They see the 10 Commandments as some group of rules that were randomly chosen by some cosmic force and slapped down on stone and given to us to keep us in line. And that, God's governing all of the world based on the 10 Commandments. And if anybody disobeys one of those, that's it. You're done. But the true heart of Christianity is not at all that God is a boss, that Jesus is a boss. And in fact, Jesus is much less about that, and he's much more about mercy and grace. And in fact, the 10 Commandments were given to us as an act of mercy and grace, as a loving gift, not from a tyrant in the sky, but from a father who wants to show us how to live. We've been working our way through the Bible this year. We've come to Exodus chapter 20, and if you think through the story of the Old Testament, the story of the people of God, it really starts in Genesis 12 when God comes to Abraham. He says, Abraham, I want you to get up and move to the land I show you, and I'm going to bless you and give you a great nation. And he does. And the great nation grows mainly in Egypt for 430 years as they're slaves there. And then at the end of the 430 years, God sends Moses. And through Moses, God works great trials, tribulations, plagues on Egypt. And so Pharaoh's hardened heart finally breaks, and he lets them go, and they're freed from slavery. God parts the Red Sea and they walk across. And now that's where we pick up the story today in Exodus chapter 20 as this new nation is just getting started, and God comes to them with maybe what you might think of as like their constitution, the law. These are the rules to guide this new nation. Exodus 20. Exodus 20 is where we're at, and we're going to look at the 10 Commandments today. We're not going to take time to break down each commandment and talk about, its significance and what it means. I would love to do that, but we would be here long past the beginning of the second service if we tried that. So we're going to take more of an overview approach and look at the heart of the commandments and what makes up the heart of the commandments and how they apply to us today. But before we do that, I want to look at the first 2 verses of Exodus 20, because before we talk about what the commandments are, we need to think about who they were given by. Exodus 20, verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God. God starts out by identifying himself not as just some unknown deity, but as a personal God. He is the God of Israel. He says that I am your God. See, God chose Abraham out of all the people on earth. And out of Abraham's sons, God chose Isaac. And out of Isaac's sons, God chose Jacob. And it's the descendants of Jacob that become this nation that God chose and that he called out among all the nations. He was their God. Not a tyrant in the sky, but a personal, loving, compassionate Father. It says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. God was a God that delivered them after 430 years. If you're a slave, and your parents were slaves, and your parents' parents were slaves, and your parents' parents' parents, you see where I'm going? How many of you can trace generation by generation your genealogy back 430 years? Some of you can. Most of us can't, can we? That's a long time ago. I want us to think about how long Israel was in slavery. 430 years is a long time. 430 years ago, there was no United States of America. There were barely Europeans on this continent. 430 years ago, we had just barely had printed material. You see, that was a long, long time ago. And for that length of time, Israel had been slaves. And at what point, when generation after generation after generation after generation of your people are enslaved, at what point do you lose hope? And at what point do you just say, this is just the way it is? And it's out of that hopelessness, that slavery, that God delivered them. So he's not just some guy who's disinterested in Israel. He's not just a God who is slapping down the rules. This is a personal, loving, compassionate Father who has delivered and called out his own people. And now he says to them, I need to tell you something. That's how we have to understand the 10 Commandments. Not as rules handed down by God, but as guidelines for life, kind of household guidelines for the children of Israel, telling them, here's how we behave in this family. The 10 Commandments were never designed to be a way of salvation. The 10 Commandments were never designed to be a way to teach us or anyone how to get to heaven. I read this week, a pastor from Chicago said, the law of God was never a ladder for unsaved people to climb up to heaven. It was always a pattern of life for God's people who had been saved from judgment by the blood of the Lamb. The 10 Commandments never saved anyone. They weren't intended to. They're intended to teach the people of God how to live.